in the movie!
Well, it ain't working now.
I'm in the movie line!
In 1968, no one could have guessed just how big of an impact the little film by George Romero, Night of the Living Dead, was going to have in the next 50 years. It's still one of the best zombie films ever made. It has good pacing, good characters, and an overall well-written script with an amazing tone and mood. Now, of course, there were sequels. Well, kind of. The Living Dead series has always been the strangest in film history. There's a continuity that's there, since each film revolves around a zombie epidemic, but there's never a returning character or establishment of past history. Each film stands on its own when we're talking about the Romero series. In 1978, 10 years after Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead was released by George Romero, and this one is often considered the best zombie film of all time. It has great special effects and great action scenes, and it would become a global hit, with many countries taking influence from it for the coming years. Then in 1985, Day of the Dead was released, which wasn't as praised as the other two films, but it got a cult following later on. And for a while, that was the last film that was released in the George Romero Living Dead series. It made it a solid trilogy. But around this same time, another film was released that would start its own series. Return of the Living Dead was released the same year as Day of the Dead. This was partly written by John A. Russo, one of the original writers for Night of the Living Dead. In fact, this film uses the Night of the Living Dead film as a guideline for the characters to follow when a zombie epidemic starts in their own reality. In this film, the zombies specifically eat brains, which would become a common trait for zombies in all other media. This film also had it where if you shoot a zombie in the head or cut one of their arms off, they don't die. You know, their arm would end up functioning on their own without being attached to the body. Cutting the head off doesn't do much either. Everything still functions. So it almost makes the zombies nearly indestructible. So these zombies are the real deal, and this film is almost on the same level as the Romero trilogy. Return of the Living Dead would end up getting its own film series. In 1988 there was a sequel released, and then a third one released in 1993, both of which got more negative reviews when compared to the first film. Then, in 2005, there were suddenly two more sequels. There was Necropolis and Rave to the Grave. Yeah, Rave to the Grave? That's kind of a strange title. Both of those films, released in 2005, were strange because we had waited 12 years for another Return of the Living Dead film, and then we suddenly got two in the same year. Suddenly, George Romero released another zombie film, this time Land of the Dead. This one follows the same kind of structure as the past films, but this is the first one that kind of indicates there's a continuity, because Tom Savini returns as a zombified version of his character from Dawn of the Dead. This might just be a fun cameo, but it's hard to ignore that kind of stuff, especially when this series, for as long as it's gone on, has never really made any indication of there being previous history with these zombies. Suddenly, there's a character from Dawn of the Dead, so I guess they all are in the same universe. Romero was on a roll because suddenly we got Diary of the Dead in 2007 and Survival of the Dead in 2009, which would sadly end up being his final film. Diary of the Dead is more of a found footage film, and Survival of the Dead has some of the characters from Diary return. These films mostly went ignored by the mainstream audiences, and even then, Survival of the Dead barely made any money, so most people probably don't even know that one exists. It's really sad when you compare it to the successes of his previous work. Maybe his abrupt return has to do with Shaun of the Dead, which was a really popular homage to the original series. But I also read that he was having some issues negotiating with other studios. Apparently the studios were trying to get their rights to the Living Dead series as much as they could when he was trying to make a sequel. In any case, during his absence, there was a remake of Night of the Living Dead released in 1990, which was directed by George Romero alumni Tom Savini. Then there was a highly praised remake of Dawn of the Dead released in 2004, which was directed by Zack Snyder and written by James Gunn, both of whom would get even more popular in the following years. It's funny that the Dawn of the Dead remake was the one that rejuvenated the genre instead of the Romero films that would follow in 2005. In any case, the 1990 remake of Night of the Living Dead has nothing to do with the 2004 remake of Dawn of the Dead. And then I guess to just keep with consistency, there was also an unrelated remake of Day of the Dead released in 2008, which, guess what? It was remade again this year with Day of the Dead Bloodline. And as if I can just keep going all day, in 2006 there was a remake of Night of the Living Dead in 3D, which got its own sequel in 2012. Christ, I mean, why are we doing so many remakes when you could literally just do spin-offs like Return of the Living Dead did? Well, they've been making unofficial sequels the entire time. Like in 2005, someone made a prequel to the 1985 film Day of the Dead, except it was called Day of the Dead 2. It's a prequel, why would you call it that? That's a little weird. Also, I forgot to talk about the zombie series. Yeah, because in Italy, Dawn of the Dead was retitled Zombie. So, someone else, Lucio Fulci, decided to make his own zombie film, which I guess he was actually working on before Dawn of the Dead came out, but to bank on the success of it, he called his film Zombie 2, because Dawn of the Dead was called Zombie in Italy. So, that film, which got its own cult following, ended up being released in America. But here, since there was no film called Zombie, or an official one, or like a popular one anyway, they decided to call Zombie 2 just Zombie. And then later, Lucio Fulci also made Zombie 3 in Italy, you know, a sequel to Zombie 2, which was a sequel to Dawn of the Dead unofficially. So Zombie 3 made it to America, and then Americans were like, screw it, just call it Zombie 3. So in America, there's no film called Zombie 2. Then they took other zombie films from Italy that weren't really part of their zombie film series, and they just retitled them in America to Zombie 4 After Death and Zombie 5 Killing Birds. So now we are retitling and putting films into a series that actually have nothing to do with said series, when all along this whole series was meant to be a sequel to a different series, even though it really had nothing to do with that series either. This whole thing could make your head explode. What's funny is, I'm not even done yet. There was yet another remake, an animated film done in 2015 of Night of the Living Dead, and then there's a bunch of films that simply reference the title. There's Dance of the Dead, Zone of the Dead, Hawan of the Dead, Hell of the Dead. See, this is what happens when a movie's in the public domain. Then anybody can make basically any sequel or cut of the film that they dare please. There was a 3D version of the film made, and then there was an unnecessary 30th anniversary cut of the film. And just to finish this off, there was a 2001 film titled Children of the Dead. Has nothing to do with the original Romero series, or any of these other series, but it has Tom Savini and John A. Russo attached. Another zombie film that references the title, that has nothing. This is what I call too many sequels.
Thank you for watching the video. A special thanks to Chris, Lucas, and Ryan for supporting me on Patreon. If you'd like to be like them and get exclusive access to content and blogs and even request reviews monthly, please click on the Patreon link, and thanks for your support.